American Cultures by Margaret Welch. To begin this merit badge, you need to choose 3 groups that have different racial, cultural, national, or ethnic backgrounds, one of which comes from your own background. Use these groups to meet requirements 1 through 3. For this merit badge, I've already chosen Hispanic Americans, European Americans, and African Americans. If you do not fit into one of these groups, then you need to choose one group that is your own group that you fit into to finish this merit badge. Let's start with Hispanic Americans. Hispanic Americans are members of one of the fastest growing minority groups in the United States. 1 of 3 Californians is Hispanic, and almost half the population of Greater Los Angeles is Hispanic. In the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, population growth and economic opportunity prompted thousands of Puerto Ricans to move to New York City and other large American cities during the 1950s and 1960s. Today, about half of all native Puerto Ricans live in the 48 contiguous states. Hispanics in America trace their origins not only to Mexico, but also to other Spanish-speaking nations. Many Cubans fled to Florida after the Cuban Revolution of 1959, and another wave of immigrants from Cuba followed in 1980. Now let's move on to European Americans. While most of America's early colonists were English, people from France, Germany, Holland, Scotland, and other European countries also immigrated to the colonies to seek religious freedom. In the early 1800s, English landlords oppressed the Irish, provoking many to flee to the United States. In 1845, a disease began destroying potato crops, a staple food in Ireland. During the Great Potato Famine, nearly 1 million Irish died, and another 1.6 million escaped starvation by going to America. Other waves of European immigrants included Germans in the 1840s and Italians in the 1880s. As various groups arrived in the United States, they often clashed over housing, jobs, and other social issues. If you can trace your origins back to one of these European groups, then this would be your group for this merit badge. Finally, let's move on to African Americans. The first Africans in the American colonies were indentured servants, as were many white settlers. But in 1661, Virginia passed laws permitting slavery, a practice that lasted more than 200 years in the United States. About 500,000 Africans, mostly from Western Sudan, were brought as slaves to the United States. Millions more were shipped to other countries. Most black people in America before the Civil War worked as slaves on southern farms and plantations. Some free black people worked in industry in the North. After the Civil War and into the 20th century, the determined efforts of the African Americans to gain equality and justice led to a strong civil rights movement in the United States. The slave trade, slavery, emancipation, and the civil rights movement shaped African American culture. As I said in the beginning, if one of those 3 groups does not fit your personal identity, then you need to choose a group that does. For requirement 1, you need to do 2 of the following. Choose a different group for each and then report on what you see and learn. If you're doing this merit badge at home, I recommend you do D and E. For D, learn a song, dance, poem, or story that is traditional of one group and teach it. Links are available on the merit badge webpage. For E, go to a library or museum to see a program or exhibit featuring one group's traditions. There is a link on the merit badge webpage to a virtual museum tour where you can explore different exhibits that features one of these groups' traditions. For requirement 2, you need to imagine that one of the groups had lived alone in a city or country to which no other group ever came. Tell what you think the city or country might be like today, and now tell what you think it might be like if the three groups you chose lived there in the same time. So for this, it depends on the groups that you have. I chose African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and European Americans, and because they all ended up coming to America, you don't really have to imagine that much for two, what they would be like if they all lived together at the same time. And since they came from their respective countries, you can think about what their country was like before they immigrated to the United States. For requirement 3, you need to tell some differences between the religions and social customs of the three groups. As I said before, my groups are Hispanic Americans, European Americans, and African Americans, but if you do not fit into one of these groups, you need to do some research for the group that you chose that's different. In terms of religion, almost 50% of Hispanic Americans are Catholic, about 70% of European Americans are Christian, and almost 80% of African Americans are Protestant, which is a form of Christianity. In terms of social customs, Hispanic Americans have the quinceañera, which is a celebration of a young girl's 15th birthday. For European Americans, they have many different traditions because they came from many different countries all throughout Europe, but many came to Ellis Island in the 1900s. For African Americans, they have the Harlem Renaissance, jazz, gospel music. The Harlem Renaissance was an explosion of culture in the African American community in the early 1900s, or in 1920s, 1930s, and there were African American books, music, poetry, you name it, there was everything. It was an explosion of culture. In terms of similarities, all Hispanic Americans, European Americans, African Americans are Americans with the same freedoms. And as you saw in the religion section, most of them are Christian. But that doesn't mean that every single person in that group is Christian. For requirement 4, you need to tell about a contribution made to our country by 3 different people, each from a different racial, ethnic, or religious background. For person 1, I chose from the Hispanic American group. I chose Justice Sonia Sotomayor. She's the first Hispanic and 3rd woman to serve on the Supreme Court. She's heard over 3,000 appeals and wrote 380 opinions on the majority. For person 2, I chose from the European American group. Albert Einstein is famous for the atomic theory and his theory of relativity and his equation E equals mc squared. He immigrated from Germany and became American in 1940. For person 3, I chose from the African American group. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is an African American who pushed for peaceful protests against segregation. For requirement 5, you need to give a talk to your scout unit or class at school on how people from different groups have gotten along together. Lead a discussion on what can be done to help various groups understand one another better. So for this, you obviously need to do it at a troop meeting or at a class at school. If you're going to do it at a troop meeting, make sure you notify your SPL so they can plan you into the schedule. I just wanted to end the American Cultures Merit Badge by saying it's incredibly important to learn about the different cultures that are represented in America, because there are people that you're probably living next to that have different backgrounds from yours, and if you don't take time to understand their background, to understand their culture and where they came from, then it's harder to make those connections that you need later in life.